Zombies, man. They creep me out.
When I think of my favorite directors, George Romero is always in that conversation. You might be asking, why is that? I think most people would say zombies, but for me, it's a bit more complicated. One night when I was 10 or 11, I discovered Night of the Living Dead at the back of our VHS cabinet. I decided to pop the tape in and watch it. At this point in my life, I was already a horror veteran with many films under my belt. Having seen every Jason and Halloween movie released up to this point, I must have thought this old black and white movie wasn't going to be very disturbing. After all, I was a huge psycho nut when I was 10, and that movie didn't scare me one bit. Do you know how big of a nerd I was for it? When Anthony Perkins died in 1992, I went to school and told all of my friends, and you know what they said?
Who?
It wasn't like I lived in a vacuum and had never heard of Night of the Living Dead. Hell, who wasn't familiar with the famous "coming to get you, Barbara" line from the fucking movie? I mean, hell, that line is in Halloween 2.
To be at large in Haddonfield. This is Robert Mundy, live.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
For whatever reason, I just had never seen Night of the Living Dead. So on this occasion, we were finally gonna watch it. And I will tell you straight up, Night did something that no other film had done before or since. It disturbed me. And I think most of that has to do with the ending. I'm just gonna say it right off the bat, this movie is almost 50 years old, so if you haven't seen it, too bad about spoilers. But every character is dead at the end of the movie. Sure, most of the people are killed by the zombies, except for our hero Ben, who is killed by the people who are supposed to be saving the day.
You, drag that out of here and throw it on the fire.
Nothing down here.
All right, go ahead down and give him a hand. Let's go check out the house, man.
There's something there. I heard a noise.
All right, Vince, hit him in the head, right between the eyes. Good shot. Okay, he's dead. Let's go get him. That's another one for the fire.
As bad as the ending was, I think the end credits might have disturbed me even more.
Alright, send the wagon through our direction. Come ahead with the motorcycle, please. Let's go, man.
For whatever reason, there's something about those still images that just got under my skin. I'm not sure if it's the guys with the meat hooks, or the fact that they're just pulling cadavers like they're nothing. Look at it this way, one of those corpses is Ben, the guy who just survived this entire ordeal only to be shot for mistaken identity. If that's not disturbing to you, I don't know what is. As the credits finish, we are treated to one final live-action shot of our so-called heroes igniting a pile of corpses, and then the film finishes.
People in the back, we're in the back.
It's such a short clip, but it says so much. Their complete, callous disregard for what used to be people. I mean, after all, they did just kill a guy without finding out if he was actually a zombie or not. Those were my initial thoughts of Night of the Living Dead. But as time went on, the disturbing nature lessened, and I grew to appreciate Night of the Living Dead for the great movie that it actually is. Years later, I caught a replay of Creepshow. I saw this movie when I was still in preschool. I know, crazy, right? But it was the 1980s. Shit like that happened to everybody I knew. It scared the piss out of me, which is understandable considering my age. Anyways, it finally dawned on me while viewing the credits for Creepshow that the guy who directed Creepshow had directed Night of the Living Dead as well. And that's when I became a George Romero guy. I guess the logical question is, why am I a fan of George Romero? I love the social commentary that is present in most of his films. Another reason I love George Romero is for his use of practical special effects, most of which were done by the great Tom Savini. But I think the biggest reason is I'm just a fan of horror. Romero created the modern horror genre. Almost 50 years later, we are still living in the age of George Romero. Every great horror director that has come along in the last 50 years has cited George Romero as one of their primary influences. There is something about the way in which he viewed the world that makes him extremely unique. He seems to have little faith in the idea that humans can get along and work together. Regardless of which film of his you watch, It always features people trying to band together and ultimately they muck it up in some way.
We're getting out of here right now. Give me any shit about it, I blow his head off.
Holy Bird can't hold us all.
Us all ain't going. Me, my men, you, that's it.
You'll never get me to do that, Rhodes.
Romero definitely has nothing but contempt for the institutions that hold power. Whether it's the government, religion, or the military, these institutions are almost always portrayed as incompetent and full of ridiculous red tape. An example of this would be his film The Crazies.
I'm for going with the radiation scenario. The thing is, we can release it now, and it covers us for any eventuality.
The onus on it.
Sure, it's embarrassing. It's not as embarrassing as bioweaponry. At least everybody knows we've been using nuclear weapons. So we had an accident. We'll blame it on AEC.
Many of George Romero's films deal with the idea of racism. Most of his characters endure racism at one point or another during these films. Whether it's Miguel from Day of the Dead, who's constantly being called racial slurs, or like in Dawn of the Dead, when a white cop goes nuts and just starts shooting black people because they're black.
Come on, you little bastards!
He's gone apeshit, man.
His movies also delve into the distribution of wealth in America. In particular, how even after the fall, the rich can somehow maintain power. This is one of the prevalent themes of Land of the Dead.
How long are you gonna let Kaufman push you around? You like shining his shoes, pressing his pants? He didn't build that place. He just took it over. Kept the best for himself and left us with a slum to live in.
In most cases, his films portray strong women who take action. It is true that Barbara from Night was a total basket case, and Franny from Dawn started out as completely useless, but she learned to hold herself. It wasn't until Day that we finally got the badass woman we needed. Romero has said on audio commentaries that Sarah was his apology for Barbara. We thank you, George.
Can't believe you guys are turning me into a fucking Boy Scout.
Not a boy.
Another hallmark of Romero films is that he writes very non-typical black characters. He writes sensible, down-to-earth, believable characters, and they don't die right away, dispelling that whole myth that the black guy dies first. These characters almost always have the best head on their shoulders, and while watching, one can easily relate and say, if I were in this situation, I would definitely be them. He also saves all of his best speeches for his black characters.
They're after us. They know we're still in here.
They're after the place. They don't know why, they just remember. Remember that they want to be in here.
What the hell are they?
They're us, that's all. There's no more room in hell.
What?
Something my granddaddy used to tell us. You know Macumba? Voodoo. Granddad was a priest in Trinidad. He used to tell us, when there's no more room in hell, the dead will walk the earth.
You ain't never gonna figure it out. Just like they never figured out why the stars are where they're at. It ain't mankind's job to figure that stuff out. So what you're doing is a waste of time, Sarah. And time is all we got left, you know.
What I'm doing. That's all there's left to do.
Shame on you. There's plenty to do. Plenty to do. So as long as it's you and me and maybe some other people, we could start over. Start fresh. Get some babies. And teach them, Sarah. Teach them never to come over here and dig these records out.
Have you ever heard of the term Rogering out?
No!
Well, you can thank George Romero for this. You see, in the movie Dawn of the Dead, there's a character named Roger. Roger starts off as the level-headed, rational one.
Gotta find fuel. Maybe closer to Cleveland.
No, we gotta stay out of the big cities. If there's anything like Philly, we may never get out alive.
We may never get out of any place alive. We almost didn't get out of here.
We're getting out of here fine, Peter. Just as long as there are not too many of those things around, we can handle them easy.
It wasn't one of those things that nearly blew me away.
We gotta stay in the sticks. I mean, there's bound to be more little private airports upstate.
There's the locks along the Allegheny. Fuel stations there. State, private.
No, those are probably still manned. We don't need those hassles either.
But for some reason, something makes him snap, and he loses it.
Get his head up! Fucking get his head up, man!
We got this, man. We got this by the ass.
You all right?
Perfect, baby. Perfect.
And because of this, he is eventually bitten and dies.
Roger! Roger, watch it! Damn!
Sound like just a bunch of people talking, a bunch of
This is not
scientists without
political
actually
rhetoric.
figuring
We're not
it out.
fighting. This is not the Republicans versus the Democrats. They've got us in the hole.
So next time you're watching anything to do with zombies and you see a character lose it, now you'll know to call it rogering out. Surprisingly, nudity is not something you see in the Dead films. I can only think of 3 instances where nudity shows up. But there is one point of contention that the detractors of these films always stand by. That these movies are nothing more than gore fests. And you know what? They're right. They are gore fests, but there is a point to the gore. 1, it's to make the movies feel believable. And 2, it's there to speak out against censorship, specifically the MPAA. Because of the MPAA's censorship of his films, Romero was never able to get an R rating. Without that R rating, your movie will not be seen in any of the major theater chains, which is a problem when you're a low-budget filmmaker. That was Romero's problem. He was a low-budget filmmaker. Almost all of his films were released without major studio backing and very low budgets. So when you've put all that hard work and effort into making something and nobody can see it and you can't make any money, you're fucked. So if you're George Romero and you know you're never going to get that R rating, fuck it. Just go balls to the wall. Do what you feel you need to do to make the film you want to do. And to his credit, Romero said fuck it, and that's exactly what he did, and I love him for it. And there you go. That's why I love George Romero. He was an independent director who bucked tradition and bucked the studio system. Even though they saw him as a genre guy, he was much more than that. Now, if that long-ass breakdown was too much to understand, I think George summed it up best when he said, I always thought of the zombies as being about revolution, one generation consuming the next. With that, this episode is pretty much over. I don't really know what else to say. I admire the guy as a director. That's why his passing this past July was so difficult to take. There will never be another George Romero. But in the spirit of remembrance, I'm going to take the next couple of episodes to do a retrospective on some of George's stuff. We could go the traditional route and review some of his famous films, but we don't do shit like that on this channel. Instead, I opted to go and review some of his lesser-known films that he directed, cameos I'm sure no one even cared existed, and his many, many video game appearances. So my dear viewers, till next time, Romero-Ween is going long.